Hello, hi everybody. So today I want to chat with you about how much I appreciate YouTube. YouTube is by far my favorite social media, and that is for the most part because it is long form content. Because of long form content, we can get an honest, albeit tiny compared to real life, glimpse into each other's world in a way that was not possible before the creation of YouTube. We're so lucky to have a platform on which we can share things that we love and care about in a detailed way. Social media is great for artists. We can share our stuff with the world without having to impress the powers that be or to first prove ourselves to the chosen ones. We can share anything that we want and someone is going to see it. YouTube's long format is the best in my opinion because we can go into detail about our process and we can share the spaces that we work in. We can share things in real time, the muddy, messy details, the epiphanies, the roadblocks, the struggles, if we want to share all those things. While I chat with you about all that, let's do another experiment like the one we did the other day in my video, Why I Don't Make New Year's Resolutions. In that video, we were working with rubbing alcohol and salt and a couple other household items. Let's do the same thing, but what I'd like to do now is to use complementary colors of different watercolor brands. So I've got core watercolors here, as well as Winsor and Newton, and I've got several other brands, and I'd like to compare how these different brands can create different effects, because each different watercolor brand has different color ingredients, has different types of ingredients that they use. And if you like this sort of thing, this sort of experimentation, please consider liking and subscribing, because maybe you want to come back for that type of thing. People oftentimes talk about the downsides of social media, but to be honest, over the last few years, my attitude's become more and more positive. I believe that social media fills the holes of connection that we're missing in our culture, our society. Social media hasn't made the holes, it's exposed them. It illuminates the holes that were already there. And in illuminating these holes, it often gets blamed for it. The thing is, social media is just a tool, and like all tools that humans make, it can be abused. Tools are neither really good or bad, but how a tool is perceived often reflects on how people are using the tool. For example, like a chainsaw, most of the time people just cut bushes and trees with it, but every so often somebody uses it for something nefarious. But, chainsaws generally don't get a bad name for just existing. Social media somehow has, although in my experience, it's been incredibly positive overall. So far. I should mention that for the most part, I've tried to keep my kids off of it, especially when they were younger. But for consenting adults, I think it's fair game. I think the most positive thing about social media, in my perspective, is the ability to build relationships and create communities among people who wouldn't have had access to each other otherwise if it weren't for social media, or I guess just the internet in general. So as far as what I'm doing on the paper here, I'm using 100% cotton watercolor paper. I'll be using 3 different brands throughout this entire video. This particular brand is Winsor & Newton, and I'm trying to make sure that I put down enough water that there are effects. If the wash that I put down isn't watery enough, it won't work. However, it doesn't matter if the wash is nice or pretty, because it's just going to get messed up, and that is literally the point. I'm making sure to keep my eye on the color wheel and get colors that are complementary colors, or at least close to, and I'm putting the salt on the right side and the alcohol, or the rubbing alcohol, on the left side. for most of the tests. I do these kinds of experiments pretty frequently, and it's really great to have a platform to share it on, to show people what I'm doing and see if anybody else likes doing similar things as well. I think that there are far superior ways of connecting that do not involve social media, but it's really frequent that these superior ways are not always available to everybody. It gives a voice to those who would not otherwise have a voice, and it creates connections between people who would otherwise probably never meet. The gatekeeping of social media is a lot lower than real life, and the variety of the kinds of people that you could meet is much greater if you choose to not just, stay on your narrow path of people who you perceive as just like you. People can choose to stay in their bubble, but I think the people that choose to do that would have done that social media or not. So far, the core experiment has been really fun with the reds and green. I mean, it's kind of a blue-green, but it's my favorite, so we're going to use that. The blue and the yellow. No. Well, I don't like the combination. I still haven't tried putting the blue on top and then putting the salt and the rubbing alcohol on the top layer. I haven't tried that yet, but so far I'm really underwhelmed by this color combination here. And now I'm going to try out Winsor & Newton, which is a less reactive type of watercolor. The one I used in my other video, Daniel Smith, tends to be a lot more splashy and granulating, and then Core isn't necessarily granulating, but it moves a lot, moves quickly on the paper, so I expect to see a lot of movement here. So I expect to see less on this one. Also, I'm using Canson, which is almost a cold press paper to me. It seems a lot more cold pressy than Winsor & Newton paper. Now, the paper I use the most is Arch, but that's being used. Real big pad is being used by this one, and I'm not done with it, and I'm not gonna pull it off, so I need to get myself another big Arch pad. I think I have another one, I just don't remember. I need to check. I will look for it because that would be the best thing to do an experiment on, because that is what I use the most, because it's what I like the most. To be fair, this is the only Canson pad I've ever used, and I bought it damaged for a discount, so maybe I haven't given it a fair shot. And then I'm using Winsor & Newton paint on it. Now I realize, could have used the Winsor & Newton paint on the Winsor & Newton pad. Think of it at the time, and it makes me wonder how many brands that make watercolor paints also make high quality paper. I don't think Arch makes watercolor paints. Back to bubbles, social media is still out there for those of us who want to broaden our experience, and we can get addicted to it and abuse it, but today I'm gonna mostly just focus on the positives, specifically long form content positives. But shorts and other shorter form content has so many wonderful attributes. I'm just not gonna chat much about them today. One nice thing about long form content is that the risk of shortening your attention span by watching it, especially if you watch to the end of the video, which I try to always make myself do, is a lot less. I remember Minnie Small mentioning years ago that making YouTube videos slowed her art development. And in fact, I've heard a lot of other artists on social media say these types of things. I was concerned about that initially, and I think I actually mentioned it in the first video I ever made, that it was a fear of mine. But one of the things that I've noticed is, number one, I really love editing, and I find it to be an art form in itself. And balancing between making visual art and editing has actually helped me not burn out on either one. Editing tends to take up more time, and I have to manage it carefully, but I now almost never burn out on painting or drawing. It's a privilege, and it's special, and it's not a chore. So when I get to do it, I'm really happy about it. There are plenty of artists who hate editing or never get burned out on making their visual art, and for them, these benefits might not be as strong, but for me, it's definitely a beautiful balance. I'm super grateful to all content creators. Well, all is a strong word. I am super grateful to all the content creators who give a window into their life in an authentic and loving kind of way. I really appreciate the people who are sharing their genuine lives and their genuine experiences. As someone who's studied anthropology, I adore YouTube. People voluntarily tell you about their lives and sometimes even film it. I've learned so much about different walks of life by watching YouTube videos. People share everyday stuff and it's magical. I've gotten to see how somebody in a wheelchair modifies their environment to make their kids' school lunches. I've gotten to see how other neurodivergent individuals organize their schedules, and I've gotten to see what it would be like to be in a cult. And other people who have had these experiences, they get to watch each other. They get to see what kind of experiences people like them have. Often these common experiences wouldn't be available to them otherwise. So we've got our Winsor and Newton paper with core watercolor on it and Canson paper with the Winsor and Newton paint on it. Yeah, I didn't think that through. And they're kind of on top of my heater. So we're gonna dry them. And I did find some Arch papers. In addition to getting to understand and learn about people from many different walks of life, I get to see into other artists' studios, which is wonderful because for the most part, making art is incredibly isolating if you're not in a school type setting. But YouTube definitely makes it less isolating. I feel much more connected to the artistic community and to the people who are making art that's similar to the kind of art I make and the way that I go about making it. I also get to see how other people do it, how they live their lives, how do they manage it financially, or how do they make time for it, all of that. Not only is being an artist isolating by the nature of the kind of work it is, but being an artist oftentimes means that you see the world in a unique way, and that in itself can feel isolating. YouTube makes being an artist feel much less lonely than it might otherwise feel. I feel not only connected to my fellow artists, but to people who I would have had no contact with by virtue of the fact that we often live on different continents. But I get to learn from them anyways because they choose to share. I love nothing more than a process video or a studio tour or a vlog where someone just talks about how they raise their kids. I love being invited into an artist's workspace, even if it's just the kitchen table. I love seeing the supplies that they choose to work with and the behind the scenes mess. I love seeing the marks that they make, the colors they choose, and the different ways that they use their tools. When I share my own work, processes, tools, I feel like I'm part of a community of artists. And though making art can be a really lonely endeavor, and I really do relish my solitude, at some point it doesn't feel good anymore. And sharing what I'm doing can feel like talking to a friend. It feels like sharing the fun toys that I get to play with. I love learning something new and then making sure I pass that information along. And YouTube provides that space to educate in the long-winded format that I prefer. I did find the Arch paper and I opted for Mijello, which is the most put it there and it stays watercolor there is. So I'm actually really surprised by the results. How much it's not mixing and how it's separating out compared to the Winsor and Newton, which blended and kind of stayed blended. This one is definitely separating out. I mean, it was separating out as I was putting it on the paper. This one, not quite as much. This one just makes a nice solid color. Winsor and Newton's supposed to be great for layering. Core is just unique. Mijello is great if you want control. And I would say Winsor and Newton wins for if you want control. Oh, This is kind of interesting. That's probably when I added water. Now I'm gonna take a break and wait for it all to dry. But I'm gonna clean my brushes first because I do not want paint getting stuck in them. All the first layers of watercolor are now done. I will now add a second layer to all the top tests, but the bottom tests are all finished. I've spared you how much scraping is necessary to get the salt off by editing out most of the salt removal, which I am sure a quick Google would help me find something more efficient than my nail. I tried a coin and that was relatively ineffective. Here I'm doing the first of the double layered tests. Let's see how different doing a single layer with the colors mixed up versus the same colors separated into two different layers makes a difference. Back to the idea that sharing on social media slows an artist's growth. That might be true. Artists might be a lot faster in their skill building if they had a private benefactor, a sugar mommy, a sugar daddy, something like that. That would definitely help a lot of people. But, honestly, sometimes pressure is good. Sometimes it helps people grow. It might be faster to have a side gig and then to just make art on the side for fun. But for a lot of people, creating art on social media is lucrative enough for them to stay on the path, and they might otherwise fall off the path or give up if they didn't have a way of connecting to an audience. How different would Van Gogh or many other artists that didn't get famous until after they died, how different would their stories have been if they had been able to promote their work more effectively? Nearly all artists are small business owners, and we spend a tremendous amount of time doing not art-related tasks, no matter what. Nowadays, I plan, film, edit videos, and sometimes shorts, but other artists, they're creating TikToks, they're on Twitter, making Instagram reels, Instagram posts. They might be restocking their items, designing and building their websites, doing their taxes, making prints, packaging them and sending them out, going to shows, making art to go to galleries, having gallery openings. It never ends. And for artists, there's so much to do that isn't art. Does it really matter if it's online versus in person? If I had to do everything in person, I doubt I'd be doing this. When I was a little kid and grown-ups would ask the cliche question, what do you want to be when you grow up? One of my answers before I saw Shamu and decided marine biology was for me was I want to be an artist. I also said I wanted to be a mom. It's funny because back then I didn't really think that I'd have to choose. But by high school, I figured out that I did. I did have to choose. And I decided not to make art. All I knew was about galleries, and I felt that world was way too competitive for me, and I decided to do something practical instead. And because of certain choices I made, I ended up having kids pretty young, even though that wasn't in my original plan. By the time I came up for air and re-entered the world of art, as social media existed and was amazing. And I decided that I could honor my childhood dreams of becoming an artist, like a professional artist, like that's my job. And I'm super grateful to not only be sharing my art, but to be sharing my knowledge, my ideas, my perspectives, my way of seeing the world. I'm really grateful to have a platform on which I can share all that. We all have a voice. We all have things to say. We all have our own perspectives, our own way in which we have been in the world, that the world has treated us, affected us, what we've learned from the world. Although most of us have a physical voice, a voice that we can speak with, so many of us don't use it. So many of us don't say the things that we care about or share our stories. And I think that all social media, and particularly for me, the long format content is a wonderful opportunity to be sharing the things that we know and to be sharing our particular voice. And now I'm going to use my voice to excitedly tell you all about the results of my experiment. It's been a day and everything is definitely really dry. And the sun has come back out, and so I can look at these all in natural light. And I'm noticing that the Winsor Newton, Core, and Mijello watercolors all kind of behave differently with the salt. So the Mijello as well as the Winsor and Newton created these kind of star effects, which I think is super interesting. That was done by a water bloom. This is salt. The Core watercolor doesn't have the star blooms, and if it does, they're much smaller. It's much more delicate in how it distributed the salt. This to me looks similar to what happens with Daniel Smith. For the alcohol, the rubbing alcohol, I mean, the way it responded on the Mijello was more, I don't know, streaky. I don't know if it was how I applied it, but it certainly created a much more substantial barrier. With the Core watercolor, again, like much more delicate in how it responded. Much more subtle patterns. I think my color choices were more bold because I used this darker quinacridone burnt orange, whereas I used just a red and red. I couldn't say which red that was. This red is permanent red. All of these, the bottom ones are all mixed color. And I would say that the Winsor and Newton blended and stayed together the most. And it could be those specific colors. It might not work with every Winsor and Newton paint, but it did with those particular ones that I chose. And with these, it separated out a little bit. And then these ones, I mean, it separated out so much, which really surprises me because Mission Gold, like when you put the paint down, it kind of just stays there. So the way it's responded is not what I was expecting at all. Core watercolor goes everywhere. It's all wild. And this delicate, you know, gentle variations is not what I was expecting. And then the Winsor and Newton also tends to be like, I put it there, it's going to stay there, and know that it's good for layering. So I assumed it would be more easily controlled. That is the rundown of yesterday's experiment. A little bit bigger than what I was planning. I was planning to just test 2, but just had to throw in that third one. And I'm so glad I did because the results are really not what I was expecting. And I think I will I'd like to know more about how all of my watercolor brands that I have would work. And I'd also like to know more about the different colors within the brand, how they might perform. Please get off. Okay, this is a better spot for you. Thank you so much for joining me while I gush about my love of long form content and my love for YouTube while we're playing with paint and color. And hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Bye.